Well, welcome everyone to today's Silicon Valley Forum Fireside Chat. Title is Successful Communications, Successful Company, with my dear friend and colleague and former business partner, Stephen Drake. We've got a few
Aaron,
announcements.
great to see
you. Great to have you. We'll have a few announcements and we'll get into the heart of our conversation. But the Silicon Valley Forum, we are a California-based 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our mission is to foster innovation, entrepreneurship, and leadership in Silicon Valley and throughout the world. We achieve our mission through events, programs, and conferences, and we aim to function as a center of knowledge and connections. We cover everything from the latest tech trends to the startup investment ecosystem, and our activities are aimed to educate, train, inspire, and connect technologists, entrepreneurs, corporates, and investors. We've got a few events coming up where we might have one more fireside chat in August, but really we'll get back to our programming in the fall. For those of you who live in the San Francisco Bay Area, we'll do the annual California Coastal Cleanup Day somewhere in Santa Clara County, probably at the southern tip of San Francisco Bay. We are planning our first State of the Global Tech Sector luncheon in Silicon Valley, location to be determined, but that will be on Thursday, December 11th. And never too early, Star Tides, be part of the Star Tides event, and more in Steve's neck of the woods, over in Arlington, Virginia. Silicon Valley Forum will actually be hosting our own side event as part of that at George Mason University at the Arlington campus, and then we'll be at the Pentagon from April 15th to 16th. The lawyer likes to have us have this disclaimer. The Silicon Valley Forum, a California Public Benefit Corporation, or SVF, does not endorse or sponsor any commercial product, service, or activity. SVF's production of this event does not constitute endorsement by SVF or its representatives. All SVF programs and services are extended to the public on a non-discriminatory basis. We are a public 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we do solicit funds from the public, and we thank you for that support. And we also want to thank the following corporate sponsors for their support of the Silicon Valley Forum Fireside Chat Series: Blocks, Forensic Financial Services, Global Tactics, Grove Analytics, and Lyman Communications. So with that said, we will end the stop sharing and get into the conversation. I have had the pleasure of knowing Steve for, I think we came together in about 2007, I think officially, so almost 20 years. I think both of us had a little bit less gray in our hair, but we are wiser, wiser since then. But one of the things that was interesting about Steve was meeting you is the ability to learn. And we eventually came together and formed a company and co-led that company for 10 years. But I've always said, when you look at surrounding yourself with people, your immediate network, you got to be able to learn from each other. And I've had the pleasure of learning from you, Steve, over the years. And I thought the timing would be good to get you and I to have this conversation. But before we get into kind of the backgrounds and how you see the world, and you've done some very interesting experiences, and we'll get into a lot of the work you've done in China. But tell us more about your business, Stephen Drake Associates, and the general question is, what's the problem you're solving, and who are you solving it for?
Well, the problem I'm solving right now is my long irons pushed to the right. No, I'm kidding. That's an ongoing problem that'll never be solved. My golf game, but so professionally right now, I guess under Stephen Drake Associates, I have a public relations agency client, and the problem I am trying to solve for them is not necessarily on behalf of one of their clients, although they've hired me to help them manage a number of accounts and projects over the years. But rather, I'm actually serving as somewhat of an editor, and I would call myself kind of a writing coach. By that, I mean I'm helping particularly some of the junior and mid-level folks in this PR agency, reviewing some of their work, and my client Peter Stanton, the head of Stanton Communications, has said, I don't want you just to make their communications beautiful and send it back, and then they'll turn it in, and we'll all think that it's great. But I want you to please coach them, teach them how to become a better writer. So as kind of a lifelong communicator, and also a university kind of what we call professional track instructor, I was happy to take on that role. So I'm working with with these kids. they're young adults, obviously 20 to 30-year-old, and it's not that they are bad writers, bad communicators, but somewhere along the line, not all of them were necessarily sort of trained in what I call AP style, more journalistic writing, etc. So that's really the problem I'm helping solve for Stanton Communications. With my other company, RFP Associates, we're something of a kind of like a headhunter. I have a partner in that business. We're like a headhunter, only we are working on behalf of corporate clients or nonprofit clients who are shopping, if you will, for a communications or a research or a public affairs firm. And so, as our name would suggest, RFP, as in request for proposal, we are, I call us sort of the RFP cops, right? So we're, the client doesn't outsource the decision on who they're going to hire. And I'm happy to get back into this later. I can nerd out all day on, the best way to hire professional services, but we sort of manage this RFP process. And so currently, my partner and I are working on behalf of a very large, influential, and well-heeled medical society, the nonprofit, and they are thinking about outsourcing some of their marketing function. And as you can imagine, a medical society like that is selling to their members, and in some cases non-members, publications, research, in their case, accreditation, inspection and accreditation for laboratories, etc. So it's big bucks for them, but it also is a little sensitive because it may involve some of their staff either being put in different roles or separated from the organization altogether. So we're starting that process. So it's a little bit different than sort of our normal client, who's looking for either a investor relations firm or public relations firm, or a research, marketing research company, etc. So
Yeah, you've worked with large corporations. You've worked with small businesses. You mentioned nonprofits. You work with government agencies. What does I guess the first question is that how does each one differ as you're working with them? And particularly, so there's two questions. How does each one differ in advising them and working with them? And what's the underlying commonality when it comes to communications, common practices or common mistakes that's made when it comes to successful communications?
Well, I think, across the board, and I've been sort of at this professionally for, dare I say it, 41 years, pretty much since I graduated from the University of Maryland in 1983. So, the commonality, whether it was a client that I served in 1984 or the clients I'm serving in 2025, at the end of the day, and obviously our tools, our communications tools have certainly developed. We have this thing called the internet. We have social media. We have, and then on the other side of the coin, we have, metrics and analytics that we can look at. And I'm happy to nerd out about that as well. But at the end of the day, I think the commonality across clients is, well, it really refers back, Aaron, to the question you asked me. What is the problem that we need to solve? And, who comprises the key audience for that problem? Who are the key stakeholders, if you will, for the company, the nonprofit, the client? And what are the most effective messaging, and obviously channels to help that company or that client tell the story to audiences that matter, right? And that's what in my definition of stakeholders, that's what stakeholders are: audiences that matter, right? That they are not necessarily one monolithic audience, right? But they are important to the success, or frankly, they can cause problems, and ultimately they can affect the failure of a client. So, and sometimes it's just as important to listen to and communicate with those who would have you put out of business or competing with you, as much as it is your customers, your shareholders, et cetera. So that's sort of at the broad level. And I guess I've been fortunate, I guess, to see my business communications, corporate communications, develop from in 1984, the mid 80s. We were all about earned media, right? We were all about getting our clients ink, right, in the newspapers. And there were one or two of those in each of the major markets. We had obviously network television news. There were three or four big networks. We had maybe one big radio news station in each market, and so that was sort of our kind of realm. Obviously, fast forward 40 years later, we have a lot more different ways to communicate, and both ways, by the way. I've told my students for years, it's just as important to be a good listener and researcher in public relations as it is to communicate the perfect soundbite, the perfect speech, or the perfect press release, announcement, et cetera, right? So you need to understand and continually get that feedback from all those key stakeholders, those key, what we call publics. So.
Yeah, the notion of a press release certainly has changed since I started my career in '93, and as you know, and people on this in this chat know, I recently joined the executive team and took a equity stake in a company based in Salt Lake City, and I thought, well, kind of doing business the old-fashioned way, we'll put out a press release, announcing my joining the company, and then. But there was something reassuring. The Salt Lake Business Journal actually published it 2 days ago. I joined the company on June 1st, and so thank you. So it was kind of vindicated, because there are people around the company said, well, why waste the time? No one really reads this, and it's just like, well, it does matter. You do get mileage, and then it does show activity within the business. No different than I actually attended an event this morning in Palo Alto, and it was hosted by a large law firm, and the focus was on private equity and trends in the private equity and VC space, and it was interesting because during the typical world of startups and that I live in, that we still very much live, or startup founders live in, if you build it, they will come. And so we were talking about messaging and what's the value proposition, and how important that is in your communication, not just the product. What is the value to the customer, prospective customer? So some of that resonate. Let me kind of take a step back. You mentioned that you attended the University of Maryland. I know your background, but kind of talk to us about, share with us, where did you grow up? And why did you choose the University of Maryland? And was your plan, the intent when you went to college to study communications and have a career in the field?
Well, I am from this area, and that is, I'm sitting and speaking to you now just outside Washington, D.C. It's funny that Aaron, that you call these discussions fireside chat, because it is 94 degrees and it's about 98% humidity. That's why they call Washington the swamp, by the way. I know you guys get heat out in Silicon Valley, but you get the dry heat. So, but anyway, I grew up in the DC area, specifically in the suburbs of Maryland. And so that's kind of a short story of why I ended up at the University of Maryland. But relative to communications, I think it goes back to, it actually goes back to high school. And I actually was fortunate to attend what was the first sort of magnet school in the suburban Maryland county where I grew up, which is about 20 minutes away from where I'm sitting right now. And I tested into what was called the Science and Tech program, right? So it was, a very early, and again, this is going back to 1976, et cetera. So I tested into the Science and Tech program, and then soon realized that, when I started getting C's in geometry and calculus and things like that, but I was excelling in things like advanced placement English and history, and I was being, patted on the back by all sorts of teachers about what a great writer I was. I said, maybe I need to work with the right side of my brain and not the left side, or whatever it is. So I dropped out of the Science and Tech program, but fortunately it was our home school. It was a brand new school. So I got to stay and finish up, obviously using my right side of my brain. And I decided I was, because of that, and because everybody said, oh, you're a great writer, I went to the University of Maryland because it was kind of the local school. Maybe 15 minutes away from where my parents were. I actually commuted from home from mom and dad's house the first couple of years before I moved on campus. But the point is, I wanted to study, and I thought I was going to become a journalist. So I went to the College of Journalism, and one of the tracks in the College of Journalism at that point where was they had print, writing and editing, broadcast, and they also had advertising, and they had this thing called public relations as a track within. So your degree would be a Bachelor of Science in journalism with a specialization. And so I took a public relations class and kind of fell in love with it. And so here it kind of combined my love of communicating and being a communicator, but doing so on behalf of an organization, sort of even at that tender age of whatever, 19 or 20, sort of intrigued me. And so I guess I did get pretty focused early on in terms of communications. Got a little scholarship money, went on, and it ended up taking me 10 years, but I ended up getting a master's degree in public relations management from the College of Journalism, wondering as I was working, taking these night classes, et cetera, and writing a dissertation or, a thesis, why am I doing this? My friend said, well, are you going to get paid more money if you're, got a master's degree? And no. Ultimately, it let me teach at the other end of the rainbow there, which was great. But anyway, so I sort of knew that I wanted to get into public relations and communications pretty early on. So that was my experience through college. And then again, after that, I ended up working for mostly a series of PR firms, PR agencies. Um, Here in Washington, there were, obviously big offices of the big major PR firms that were mostly headquartered in New York, but they had a big DC presence that combined, lobbying and public affairs issues work together with a little bit of kind of marketing communications. Although again, this particularly in the mid to late 80s, this was a government town, and still is, obviously, but there is actually much more on the corporate and marketing side as well now. So anyway, I could go on and on, but that was kind of the beginnings and how I sort of got into it.
Well, let's kind of further and focus on China. You have extensive experiences in China. You've lived there. You speak the language. What took you to China? Tell us about that part of your journey.
Well, one of the DC offices of the PR firms that I worked for in DC was a company called, and it still is, called Fleischman Hillard. And in the early 90s, I always tell people, I don't know if it was that I was doing something right or if I was doing something terribly wrong, but I was kind of called into the managing, director's office, and there was our CEO in from St. Louis, where we were headquartered, together with the guy that ran the DC office. It was kind of like going to the principal's office, but having, the school superintendent in with the principal. And I'm like, holy moly, what is this all about? Anyway, they offered me the opportunity to move from Washington and open up an office for us in Beijing, in China. And I had, prior to this, I had become the quote unquote China expert, by virtue of the fact that we had a China related project, which, I won't bore everybody with the details of that, but it came at a time in my life that, I was making some other transitions, and it sounded like a great opportunity. So that's how I ended up in China. But in basically, I started commuting to China in 1992, 1993. And keep in mind, this is just 3 or 4 years after Tiananmen Square. And so China was just starting to open up, to, foreign investors, foreign businesses writ large. Having said that, some of our biggest competitors had had a small presence, certainly in Beijing, for a number of years. So I was kind of the new kid on the block. When we officially opened the office, I did some speaking and some teaching over there, 92, 93. We officially opened the office. I just celebrated our anniversary. It was the 11th of July, 1994, when we started Fleischman Hillard Scotchbrook Link. And so, with the Chinese name was Fulai Linke. Fulai means, wonderful, good fortune, wonderful things will come. But it was, as you might guess, it was a joint venture. So I had a boss, if you will, who was kind of a retired Chinese diplomat. In fact, he was the first ambassador from China to the United States, Ambassador Chai Zemin. And then, I had a boss who was back in Washington, and he ultimately ended up out there in San Francisco, who was definitely asleep while I was trying to build this office and get clients and that sort of thing. So that's kind of really how it started. So I had this wonderful experience over 4 full years in China, where I felt like I was building a small business. I felt rather entrepreneurial. Everybody kind of left me alone as long as, clients were happy and we were, making a little bit of money and all that. In 96, we opened a second office in Shanghai. So I guess, totally, by the time I left and came back home in 1998, I guess we probably had about 25 staff, all Chinese, in between Beijing and Shanghai. And we had a nice clientele, mostly American companies doing business or trying to do business in China. Obviously, some of that was referrals from our network in the States. So, for example, one of my big clients was, I always like to, Aaron, you probably heard me say, we introduced the clean, crisp taste of Budweiser beer to 1.2 billion Chinese. That came in 95, 96. So Anheuser-Busch, now it's Anheuser, InBev, InBev was an early client, as was Walmart, which was, again, a U.S. client. We opened up the first Walmart supercenter in Shenzhen, just across the water from Hong Kong in 96, I guess it was. So it was a really cool time, to be over there, and things were just exploding at that point. Now we're up to the mid 90s, and there were a lot more people in 1995 that looked like me or you, Aaron, in Beijing than there were 10 years earlier, when some of my competitors started. But it was a great time, and I learned a lot about not only being an American in a very foreign place, and having, we could talk about that in terms of looking back at the U.S. and through the prism of being over there, and being sort of at once more patriotically American than I ever thought I could be, and yet also being critical of the United States. When my staff would ask me questions like Alban, which means boss, why does the U.S. have to be the policeman of the world? Boy, talk about a tough question to answer. But at any rate, it was great friends I still stay in touch with, terrific clients, and a wonderful experience.
Very good. Before we get away to other topics, so we just asked this on China. I get asked this one question a lot about my experiences working in China. Is that one thing you think Americans misunderstand about doing a business in China? And what do you think that the Chinese, I mean, really, that's really the question that's relevant, but also what do you think the Chinese misunderstand about Americans?
Hmm. Well, the easier of your two questions is I think the first one. I think, and maybe this is lessened now, but I think the biggest misconception that Americans have about China or Chinese business is that that they aspire to be like us. They aspire to be American, and they like American brands, and people, my bosses, when they visited, would I would take them by the world's busiest McDonald's, which was just a block or two from Tiananmen Square, and they would see the long lines and people buying their Big Macs and whatnot, and they would say, well, see, they love us, they want to be like us. And I would have to correct them and say, you guys have no idea. This is a country that has its own identity, that and its own culture. They want to be as successful as we are, and Chinese parents want their kids, or their one only child in most cases, to be much more successful than them, and they were. And I've said for a long time that capitalism has been in China for years and years and years. It's just been only recently when it's sort of allowed to come out of its shell. So I think that, and again, maybe that perception is turned around a little bit once China's sort of caught up with this country economically. In terms of Chinese misconceptions of Americans, that's a tougher one for me to. I think they. I don't know if this is a misconception, but I think they are are continually sort of stunned at our, I'll say, risk taking, our our sort of entrepreneurialism. Because in China, whether it was among my staff or client contacts, etc., the idea of maintaining one's face was paramount. I mean, that was supreme. And so, if you're worried about your standing and how you appear to others, whether it's making sure that you know the boss sits next to the right person at the banquet, or you know saying the right thing or not saying anything at all so you don't make a mistake in a meeting, um, you know that tends to obviously dampen innovation, whether it's coming up with a good PR program idea, or in this case, I'm speaking to an audience in Silicon Valley. um, Early on, again, going back in time, technology development in China, and so I think it surprised the Chinese that we were sort of bold and we didn't worry about our face as much, at least seemingly so. And sometimes that could be mistaken for being boorish or insensitive, I guess, and that sort of thing. I don't know if that directly answers your question, Aaron, but I mean, the famous story I tell was, one of the early big meetings we had with a client. 2 or 3 of my staff jammed into, we had a small little sedan and a driver, and we went off to the meeting, and my staff didn't say anything. I was encouraging them to come up with ideas. We were brainstorming with the client, and we got back in the car to go back to the office, and the staff proceeded to sort of tell me what I did wrong in the meeting. And I said, why didn't you pipe up? Oh, we didn't want you to lose face. We didn't want the boss to lose face. And I said, no. That's, that we need to operate. I hate to say this, we need to operate much more an American style. One of the things that I always pushed was, teamwork, and there's more energy and brainstorm power coming from a group. And in this case, obviously, we're trying to communicate in China. So I'm fresh off the boat, right? I've been there 3 or 4 months, and I'm expecting to come up. I'm trying to come up with these brilliant ideas about how to, hold a press conference or whatever. So, it took probably half of those 4 years that I was over there to sort of instill, at least in my staff, there's nothing wrong with going out on a limb. There's nothing wrong with being a little bit critical of what a client has done, or questioning it, and coming up with a better solution. You're not going to lose face. I'm not going to lose face. We're not going to get fired, for being good counselors, good consultants. So.
Yeah, no, I'll just kind of answer it myself. I think someone that we both know, but when Gary Locke, when I was, is I don't think everyone knows that I spent 23 years living in Seattle before moving to Silicon Valley. But when Gary Locke, the former governor of Washington State, was the U.S. ambassador, I remember having a meeting with him, and he said that Americans need to understand that while China politically is one of the world's youngest countries, it's wrapped around one of the world's oldest civilizations, and that's something that always stuck with me. Um, and then when you and I were partners in our own startup with our dear friend Bill Jorn, and we were exploring, I think, a relationship with another company, Urban Planet Mobile or something like that, and we had our interns, our young professionals, we called them, in the office in Seattle. You and Bill were by phone, and we're exploring what kind of relationship, and we spent 2 hours, at least 2 hours on the call, going over various scenarios, and as they were walking out of the conference room in our office in Seattle, I heard one of them, overheard them saying essentially what a waste of time this was, because they thought the company we were looking to have a relationship was just a poor product. And I kind of got reactive. I said, that's what we need you to do. We need to, well, we don't want to embarrass you. We have respect for you and Mr. Drake and Mr. Jorn. And I said, but that's what we rely on. We're asking you to investigate and evaluate these companies and their technology, and do that. We've got about 23 minutes here. I did enable everyone's microphones. If there's a question of anyone in the audience would like to get audience participation, and 'cause I know at least a couple of people here do have their own backgrounds in communications and marketing, and so and then there's also a gentleman here with a sales background, but. So kind of going back to the topic at hand, successful communication, successful company. Um, as the delivery of information has changed, the internet, and then even that can be segmented out. We got short videos, speaking of China, we got TikTok, we've got X, not sure, the future of that, but that type of messaging. Um, how how do you stay up on the latest, I guess, the changes in the delivery of information and an engagement with different stakeholders and how that's changed? And then how has the messaging changed, or has it not changed? Has kind of communications and delivery of the content, or not the delivery, but the content itself stay the same over the last 30 plus years, or has that in itself changed?
Well, I think, yeah, to start there and go backwards, I think, no, the content has exploded in terms of volume. I mean, I think at the end of the day, I would still counsel clients to, build their communications around core messages right now. And in, a company like Tesla, for example, you know, has a lot of different audience, a lot of different stakeholders, and they may have different messages that they need to convey, and listen to the reaction from different from different constituencies, right? Clearly, they've got customers or would-be customers, right? They also have obviously a boss who decided to get himself involved in politics, etc. That then has created other stakeholders, whether they're regulators, government types that need to be communicated with differently. I guess the point, I guess the real point though is, I said a few minutes ago that we were in the realm of earned media in public relations, in communications back in the day, right? And so public relations agencies, there was a very, very thick line drawn between public relations agencies and advertising agencies, right? And over the last 25, 30, 40 years, the lines have blurred. And so now we have, in terms of communication platforms, channels, we have what we call PESO. P is paid, right? Which again can be traditional advertising, it can be online advertising, it can be sponsored content. There's a lot of different, paid. Companies are paying influencers millions of dollars, right, to put out TikTok videos and be on X, etc. Then the E of PESO is earned, right, which is again was my realm in the mid '80s, and it still, I would argue, constitutes an important cornerstone. So back to press releases, there used to be press releases were just for journalists to try to entice them to cover a story about your client. Now press releases might serve the needs of a lot of different audiences or stakeholders. The S of Peso is shared, or we would say social media, and everything that you just mentioned, Aaron. And then the O of Peso is owned, right? So this is, begins with a company's website, and extends to, whether you're doing a blog, whether you're doing your own podcasting, whether you have a quote unquote newsletter that you issue, et cetera. And so, the tools and the ability to then measure the effectiveness of those tools have just, exploded and keep getting better and better and better. That said, it can also lead to, a lot of head scratching and confusion. How do we deploy all this? How much do we really need to spend, or invest in paid, channels to get our message out? Do we invest in paid communications with customers or would-be customers, that are going to affect our bottom line? But maybe it's better to use owned or earned media, a combination of that, to influence, public officials that, are passing regulations or can affect or slapping tariffs on our sector or whatever that can affect us in a different way. So it's really has become a lot more, both complicated, but also, it offers a lot more tools to a communicator, right? I tell my students at the University of Maryland that everyone can be a publisher, right? Everybody who has an X account or goes out, every company that goes out on TikTok, this can be individuals, right, as well as companies, right? That's that owned piece or the shared piece. So there's a lot of different ways to communicate. So, and then you've got AI on top of all that, right? So what do we need professional PR, professional communicators for? Is to figure out who we're communicating with, right? And again, continuing to listen to their needs. And it's not just counting clicks or likes and things like that. All that information is useful to know that you're getting your message across. But are we moving the needle? Have we influenced the public officials in favor of what we're doing? Are we ringing the cash register more often? With clients, are we attracting investors, the right investors? Are would-be employees, flocking to our door because we're known as a good employer? So again, I didn't mention it earlier, but your employee base constitutes a very important public or stakeholder, right? And maintaining good communications with them is very important as well. So anyway, I'm kind of blithering here, but
Yep.
I think it's a very exciting time. In many ways, I wish I could turn back the clock and I could be a 25-year-old, really coming out of school now, because it's the world is your oyster. I mean, there's just a lot of opportunity, and again, it can be challenging and complicated, but it also can be very rewarding to, again, help a company achieve some of its goals or objectives through good communications. A lot of other things have to work. Obviously, the company has to have the right product, whether it's a technology product or a traditional product, but communicating about that to the right people is very important.
You touch on something, and I'll mention before we get to Steve's question, which is a good question, Steve Taylor. But it is interesting, again, having spent, the last 30 plus years on the West Coast, Seattle, now Silicon Valley, going promoting to the potential employee base has always been about innovation, right? That is just purely a West Coast innovation. Now I'm with a company based in Salt Lake City, Utah, and we need to hire. And now is very interesting because of the religious dynamics of Utah, family, and how companies really do operate like that close-knit family is a huge value proposition of getting people to want to be part of your company. And it's just something that I just never thought I would encounter, never even thought of. And yeah, and it's a whole different dynamic that I'm getting used to. But Steve Taylor actually presents a question that was raised when I was back in Utah 2 weeks ago. Was can you give an example of a core message versus a stakeholder message?
Well, the way that I think of messaging is a little different, but maybe what Steve, what you're saying is a core message. I think of messaging in terms of primary and secondary. So primary messages are think of them almost like headlines, right? So in Aaron, in your case, Lyman Communications, provides making this up, the most effective temporary communications under the most stressful, that work under the most stressful conditions. All right. That's your primary message. That may be one of a number of primary messages that you'd have. Your secondary messages, then, we also call them proof points, right? So if Lyman Communications provides the most effective, means of communicating under the most stressful of conditions, then, proof point number one, secondary message number one might be, it might be an example, CAL FIRE, last year deployed, this, that, and the other thing from Lyman Communications to, coordinate the activities of 850, firefighters on the, whatever the wildfire was. So, and this again kind of goes back to the college teaching I'm doing. We go through and talk about messaging in that form. So, what are 3 or 4 what we call primary messages? Maybe that's what you're referring to as core messages. And then for each of those primary headlines, messages, what are some proof points, whether it's anecdotal evidence, whether it's statistical evidence, that you can provide. And that then becomes sort of the blueprint. I mean, again, I'll talk to students that, ultimately you want both the primary messages and some of those proof points to show up, whether it's in an X post, whether it's in a TikTok video, whether it's in a press release, in some cases verbatim, but it serves as a blueprint or a guide for all your communications across those different platforms or channels I mentioned: paid, earned, shared, and owned. And that then, together is kind of what we call strategic communications. So, that's the other thing too, is, we talk about all the different platforms and all the different means of communications. At the end of the day, corporate communications need to be purposeful, right? There should be sort of a reason for every press release announcing that Aaron Rose is the strategic advisor for Lyman, that there should be some intention behind that, right? So it's not just communicating for the sense of communicating, outwardly, but it's, and that's where your public relations or corporate communications or marketing communications specialists or managers earn their keep, is all those communications should, again, complement one another, but also be very purposeful and strategic as you deploy them.
Steve, your microphone's enabled if you want. Does that answer your question? Or you want to put it in there? I want to make sure.
Yeah, it does. Well, thanks for having this and for answering that. I appreciate it. You had mentioned about kind of making sure the core message is, that the primary message, and so that's why that question just kind of rung in my back of my head and why I wanted to ask it. So I appreciate that. That's super helpful, especially as, again, I'm the sales guy that you talked about, Aaron. And so, for me, especially with a smaller company, making sure I'm getting out all of our messaging correctly and to the right people in the correct way. That's important to me. So thanks,
Absolutely.
guys.
Sure. And number one, Steve, great name, by the way, that you have there. Number two, I didn't talk a lot about it, but you're in sales, and that's where you really, really need to be purposeful with your communications, right? Because you're presumably communicating one-on-one with customers or would-be customers, and that's so all this stuff about primary and secondary messages is even more important, I think, for a guy like you who is literally on the front lines. So yeah, I mean, we don't talk a lot about that in some of these PR classes, but at the end of the day, sales communications are, that's kind of where the rubber hits the road, I think.
Absolutely.
So Jake actually put a question in here, and Jake is up in Seattle and is on an advisory board for Silicon Valley Forum, and I know he works in marketing and has been teaching me kind of the bridge between, or the bridge and the connections, interrelationship between marketing and sales. But what's your approach, Steve, on getting feedback on your core message from your stakeholders? How do you listen and drown out the noise?
Well, it's a good question, Jake, and I think in this day and age, there's a lot of different ways to collect that information, and I would say, in addition to that, the old-fashioned way of actually speaking with, and making sure at least you're talking to a subset of each of your key audiences is important. So obviously we have Google Analytics. You've got how many likes you got, how many retweets or reexes, whatever. There's platforms that help you determine whether people read the article about your company or your product. So you have that. You can use analytics to determine, has the communication actually occurred, right? Are we reaching people, and are they opening up the email? Are they opening, are they looking at our posts, etc.? That's great, right? Number two, you can do periodic, whether it's online surveying or focus group testing or whatnot. Obviously, there's a bit more of a cost to do that than sort of looking at the analytics. But the good news is you can dig down a little bit more and get a better understanding among what would hopefully be a representative sample about whether people within your key audiences not only saw something about your company or your product, but they understood it, and did they take any action as a result of that, right? And then, as I said before, the other thing, and this sometimes, because of the dominance of the internet, this becomes, particularly for young people, a challenge, frankly. And that is to pick up the phone and talk to a representative sample of, hey, I'd like to have a conversation with you. Can I take you to lunch? And talk to them about their impressions of the new product, or what's going on with your company, etc. Now, that's very qualitative in terms of the information you're going to collect, but I would argue that that's probably as important, or in some cases more important, than all the analytics and all the statistical analysis you could do over an online survey, etc. I mean, taken together, you can get a lot of good information, but I don't think anything substitutes for actually talking to your customers or your shareholders, or the legislators that, can affect you. And again, that's easier said than done. And the reason I say that sometimes it's a challenge for young people is, we even see this in when we're doing sort of mock, what I call pitching. Again, I told you the cornerstone of old school PR was kind of what I call dialing for dollars, sending out the press release and then following up with the reporter and saying, did you get the press release, and, literally selling a story. And it's much more of a challenge for young people, Gen Zers, et cetera, to actually pick up the phone and do that. They want to either text somebody, they want to message somebody, and then they'll say, well, I didn't hear back from them. Well, you're not going to. You need to be persistent. You have to also, not be afraid to be rejected, right? Steve Taylor is still on the line here. I mean, I imagine, Steve, that not every one of your sales calls, is successful, right? Sometimes you get a no, or you get a hand up, or worse than that, particularly with reporters. So anyway, I guess I've made my point, but it's important whether you're a CEO or you're a communication staffer in a company to, actually talk to customers, talk to the people that you're trying to reach, and say, is this making any sense? And you might be surprised at the kind of feedback you get.
Okay, you want to add to the question or response?
Yeah, well, first of all, great response there. I really appreciate it. And I definitely think you're right. I come from a little bit more of an analytical background, so that quantitative data is definitely the first thing that jumps out to tell the story. But yeah, like you're saying, grabbing that qualitative data in terms of speaking with the customer, and I'd say this transition from the qualitative being the first step to actually the quantitative being the first step, the qualitative being the first step, going from consumer marketing to, larger number of customers, whether it's, it's a B2C organization I'm helping, now moving into more B2B organizations where you have less volume, less ability to gather, data on, interactions and all that kind of thing. So it becomes way more important to talk to them and have them understand what you're trying to get at. And yeah, I guess just kind of my big thing is, developing the right questions, right? Because if you're developing the right questions, they can understand what you're trying to get at. Because people will have opinions on, the way you pitch your product and all this stuff, but if they don't know what the goal is to begin with, it's a little bit harder for them to, help with their answers.
No, good, very good point.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're near time, but I do want to kind of throw this question out to you, Steve. You've worked in positions of leadership and have taught at the University of Maryland for some time. And what's some advice you have? Some leadership advice? Either managing people, managing relationships with your staff, with your customers, clients. What's some pieces of wisdom when it comes to leadership?
Well, I mean, I think picking up on what we were just talking about, I'd like to think that the people that I've led or managed, over the years, that I have taken the time to not just to ask them questions, but to listen and learn from them. I tell, whether it's students or clients, I don't have all the answers. I want to learn as much from you as maybe I will be able to teach you or to help you or consult with you. So I think, from my standpoint, good leadership starts with, obviously treating everyone well, but more than that, having true respect for, their opinion and their suggestions, or their criticism. I mean, that's not so prophetic, I guess, but that's kind of from my standpoint. It's listening to people and being, you know, empathetic and sympathetic if they're personally having problems, but more to the point, if we're trying to achieve something, whether they're trying to achieve, you know, a better grade in class, or a client's trying to, you know, create a better communications program that's going to sell more widgets or whatever, you know, obviously I need to know kind of what they're thinking, and, you know, how are we, you know, answering the question, how am I doing? How are we doing? Or how, in this case, how am I doing as either a boss or a consultant or a teacher or a professor, that sort of thing. So.
Very good. Thank you to everyone for their participation. Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it. And you know, I know you've got a big road trip coming up. Safe travels. And you know, I was thinking about you when I saw the British Open or the championship early this morning. So yeah. So
that's really early for you guys on the West Coast, because it's like they're about done with their rounds at lunchtime here, so they're probably about done by breakfast time in California there. So, but
yeah, I had a late ending of my evening last night, and the initial golfers had teed off by the time I shut down my computer last night.
There you go.
Yeah,
well,
absolutely.
Well, let me offer my congratulations to you, Aaron, and for kind of reviving and lifting up the Silicon Valley Forum. I think what you got going is great, and I you know, was honored to be invited to have this conversation with you, and you know, I wish you and everyone on the call here and everyone listening to the call afterwards all the best.
Thank you, Steve. Wishing everyone a great day ahead. Bye bye.
Bye bye now. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.